want to tell you, this is a woman that not only believes in smart justice when she didn't have to, and it would have been very easy for her to just sit there and be silent. She stood up and made her voice known, and so we really appreciate that. Representative Heather Fitzenhagen.
Thank you so much. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to be here. I always love supporting smart justice because your mission is going to make every community in Florida better, and so I want to be part of making that happen. I'm here today with some very distinguished panelists for the Smart Innovations and Risk Needs Assessment panel, and I am going to let each of them introduce themselves, starting on my left first with David McGriff.
Thank you. And we need the PowerPoint queued up. There it is. Thank you. Barney mentioned that he asked me to put this panel together. He actually asked me and Linda Brooks to put it together. And our whole effort was going to find John to sit in the middle of it. So that's what we did. And that's all he's going to do, he said. We were concerned about being the first session after lunch because people tend to go to sleep, and then we just had Warden Kane. So now our concern is just the opposite, that we're going to have to keep you going as we go. In addition to Barney asking us to put this panel together, we also had a request, or he had a request from Secretary Jones, that she would like to see a panel on risk needs assessment. So that's what we've tried to put together for you today, and hopefully you'll have a lot of questions and a lot of interest in what we're going to talk about. In order to understand risk needs assessment, you have to understand the principles we're going to...
I'm sorry, David, did we want to just kind of go through and introduce everyone on the panel first before we
We
just...
can.
I just thought that would be
That's fine.
helpful because I think there's maybe not everybody in the room knows everyone, and that way we
Correct.
can know who's going to be talking about what. So John, you're next, if you don't mind explaining a little bit
Sure.
about your background.
I am the Director of Correctional Services for the Salvation Army in the Florida Division, and what that consists of is we have a number of programs for offenders in Florida. We do county probation, we do residential drug treatment for the Department of Corrections like we do in in Fort Myers, as well as reentry programs with the Federal Bureau of Prisons and the Department of Corrections. And I'm at the state headquarters where we oversee those programs. We do quality assurance, program development, technical assistance, that kind of thing.
Great, okay, and Linda, tell us a little bit about your background.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Linda Brooks, and I'm the manager for Community Corrections at Orange County Corrections in Orlando. I've been there, this month will be a year, so I'm the newbie on this misdemeanor panel. Prior to working with Orange County, I retired from Department of Corrections after 35 years of working with them. And so I've already told my staff who are out there, I want to introduce them, Assistant Manager Juanita Beeson, and then I have my Administrative Supervisor over inmate programs, Wilbert Danner, and Administrative Supervisor for Probation, Harriet Mathis. My area of responsibility at the jail, I have misdemeanor probation, pretrial diversion, pretrial release supervision, alternative community service, as well as inmate programs. So if my presentation, my part goes well, then I will thank the staff out there. If it doesn't go well, then hey, blame these two guys.
Thank you so much, Linda. Well, let's tee it back up for David to start us off in our substantive presentation.
And I'm glad you stopped me, Representative, because you may see in the program, advocate program, and not know what the heck that is. We're a private nonprofit justice agency in Miami-Dade County, been around for 40 years. We do all of Dade County's misdemeanor probation, most of the pretrial diversion. We have a dedicated domestic violence unit. We have a licensed DUI program, a veterans homelessness program, and a program dealing with kids in high conflict and domestic violence family cases. FACC, Florida Association of Community Corrections, has been very much discussing and very much involved in trying to put together, along with the University of Central Florida, some forward-thinking innovations in risk needs assessment. Today, I'm going to kind of put on my professor hat a little bit. Hopefully it's not a nutty professor hat, it's just a professor hat, because I have to give you some basis, and many of you know this already, but I'm going to pretend like we all need Risk Needs Assessment 101 to tell you how risk needs assessments came about. And it's the idea of risk need responsivity. Those are the three principles that are involved behind risk and needs assessments. It's the idea strongly connected to general personality and cognitive social learning perspectives. The model is very specific about several key criminal issues. The first one is the risk principle, answers the question who should be offered more intensive rehabilitative services. You heard the warden talk about wanting to deal with the more serious offenders, and that's the basis of this principle also. The need principle answers the question what? What are the most appropriate intermediate targets of service to reduce criminal behavior? And finally, the responsivity principle, and by the way, if you ever try to get responsivity by a spell checker, it's not going to work, which is what answers the question how, what styles, modes, and strategies of service are best used within offenders. R&R research basically has been going on since the 1990s, came out of Canada originally, but now it's spread throughout the world. It's vast, consistent, and for many different settings. The main empirical method for this research has been the use of meta-analysis, which is basically research on research. And for a meta-analysis to include a particular research study, it has to be empirical in nature. So let's go through these principles a little more in depth. The risk principle, two aspects. Risk in this system is, by the way, the risk of reoffending. When you hear the term recidivism is almost a research term. Sometimes we use it for reoffending, sometimes we use it for reconvicting, sometimes we use it for reincarcerating. According to this principle, risk is basically the idea, the risk that you will reoffend. We believe, and this principle believes, that criminal behavior can be predicted, and it involves the idea of matching levels of treatment service to the risk level of offender. Namely, we concentrate on the high versus the low risk offender. The need principle, again, answers the question, how? I think, yes. It's a subset of the offender's risk level. Needs are dynamic factors. Dynamic, we know, means that they change. And when they change, they're associated with changes in the probability of recidivism or reoffending.
Excuse me, David, can you explain a little bit more about the distinction between criminogenic and non-criminogenic?
Sure, and I'm going to finish the non-criminogenic part, and then I'll give you examples.
All right.
So we're going after criminogenic needs, but it doesn't mean that we ignore non-criminogenic needs. Criminogenic basically says this is a factor that's associated with committing crime. Non-criminogenic is just have nothing to do with committing crime. However, for instance, if somebody has a health problem, a health issue, that's not correlated with criminal activity, but it may be a barrier to providing treatment. Could be transportation, and if you live in Miami-Dade County and if you don't have a car, you're really in bad shape. Obviously, it's not a criminogenic need, but it may be a barrier to getting treatment if you can't get to where that treatment's being offered. And so we try to distinguish between both. Does that help?
Yes, thanks.
And the third is responsivity. By far, it's the least researched of these three principles. General offenders are human beings, and the most powerful influence strategies are cognitive, behavioral, and social learning. So we know these days that the best interventions to use with offenders are essentially cognitive behavioral. You may have heard Thinking for a Change that's been offered in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Department of Corrections talked about it yesterday. Specifically, certain interventions work best with certain people, And also certain interventions aren't going to work with certain people. The best example I give of an intervention that's non-responsive is if you take someone who speaks no Spanish and put them into a Spanish-speaking group. You're kind of violating the principle of responsivity. One of the basic tenets of this research and these principles, by the way, is this last one. The treatment offered in the community, even the same treatment, is almost always more effective than treatment offered in an institution. And the reason is, and you'll see it when we look at a couple of risk factors, it's almost the idea of who you hang out with. If you're in the community, you may have a support group going on, you may have a wife, you may have parents, you may have kids that will provide you support. If you're incarcerated, your support group is named Bubba. And so that's probably not the best thing in terms of supportive situations. So that's a general principle we go by.
David, can you explain a little bit more? You just talked about having the treatment in the community. How do you try to compensate or clear the way of negative community influences when they're trying to get treatment?
It's not so much that the community doesn't have negative influences, but we know the institutions are filled with negative influences.
Right, so it's
kind of thing.
100% negative
correct.
versus.
And in the community, hopefully, we'll have support from family members, friends, faith-based organizations, ministries, those type of things, and therefore would be an incentive for people to continue into treatment and to do better. So let me give you the brief history of risk needs assessment, risk assessments actually, and we've gone through 4 generations of them. The first one was just basically professional judgment. Somebody taking a look, observing somebody's behavior, having a conversation, having an interview, and deciding based on their professional experience and judgment what kind of risk someone was. That didn't always work. And the issue with that is it depends on the skill of the interviewer or the professional, and there was no way that could be consistent. Second generation of risk instruments, we experienced a drastic advance in technology. This one is actuarial, just like health insurance companies use actuarial data, focus on historical and static factors, no subjective judgments. It results in a numerical score for risk, and we'll see this in a minute. We're going to talk about later the proxy, which is a second generation risk assessment instrument. Third generation is where we started to make progress. Tools that consider dynamic factors, those factors that can change, and criminogenic needs. It's actuarial again, or structured professional judgment approach. The term risk need is now used rather than just risk assessments. Now we put the term need in there. And the great thing about these instruments is that they can track changes. If you're only using an instrument that never changes, that only uses static factors, you can't change how one's progressing throughout the system. It's either theoretically or empirically based, these third generation instruments. And then finally, the 4th generation, which we're on now, which takes those risk needs factors from the 3rd generation and integrates case planning and risk management into the process. It's beyond risk assessment, and into enhancing treatment and supervision. It allows the role of professional judgment. We don't ever eliminate the role of professional judgment, but we do it carefully, and we need to make sure these are grounded in research. The development of the 3rd and 4th generation of risk needs assessments could not be established without using this risk need responsivity principles. And we're finding out now, and we're seeing all around the country, and I think Linda especially is going to talk about this, we're using these at various levels throughout the system. Pretrial release, inmate classification, community supervision, and reentry release. And here's some examples of instruments. I'm giving you first the proprietary ones. which means if you want to go use these instruments, you're going to have to pay for them. The first and the granddaddy is the LSI. LSI used to be level of supervision inventory. It's now the level of service inventory case management, established by Don Andrews and Jim Bonta, who were the clinicians who created the risk need responsivity principles. Another one is Compass. It's owned by North Point Corporation. One of the newer ones is called the Strong Static Risk and Offender Needs Guide, that was established by the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, which is similar to OPAGA for us, except it's like a research OPAGA on steroids. And there's some really valuable research coming out of there if you ever want to look at, they look at a number of criminal justice items, and it's really good stuff. And they teamed up with assessments.com to create the Strong. It's two separate instruments used together. One is pure static criminal history, and then the other one is risk needs and dynamic factors. More examples. In the public domain, we have the Wisconsin Risk and Needs Correctional Assessment and Intervention System. That's used by, and that's promoted by the National Crime and NCCD and National Institute of Corrections. So this is free, and you can get it through them. And then the one we're going to talk about a little bit more today is the ORAS, the Ohio Risk Assessment System, created at the University of Cincinnati Research Center by Ed Latessa and a number of others. And there are a number of other instruments out there that we won't go into. But essentially, most of these instruments ask the same questions. And what we found out too is that most of them give us the same risk factors as a result. What we talk about is we talk about central 8 risk factors, the big 4 and the lesser 4. The big 4, which we have listed here, all start with the word antisocial. History of antisocial behavior is the only factor here that is not dynamic. There's not a damn thing you can do to change history, but it's something we need to look at to make a determination. Antisocial personality pattern, antisocial associates. Who do we hang out with? I've encouraged my probation officers every once in a while to spring a question on an offender when they're talking to them and say, who do you hang out with? And they're a little bit shocked, but we might get something out of that answer. And then antisocial thinking. We used to believe that antisocial associates was the ¡1 risk factor. Now the research is showing more and more that it's the antisocial thinking is the thing that drives people into criminal behavior. The good news is we know we have techniques through cognitive behavioral and social learning interventions to change that criminal thinking. So that's an optimistic and a positive view for us as we go forward. And then the next 5 through 8 are the lesser factors, but they're still factors. Family, marital circumstances, how are your relationships going? Substance abuse, which none of us would have excluded from this list probably. How are your relationships with school and work? And then finally, what are your habits in terms of leisure and recreation? Another question we encourage people to ask is, what do you do in your free time? If it's hang out at a particular bar, you know you have an issue, kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And these different factors, you can apply them, I'm guessing, to some degree to even the juvenile offenders.
Oh,
So
absolutely.
you can start applying them when they're very young to try to instill different corrective behavior patterns.
Yes, and you'll see, I think one of the more amazing things are the things that are not in there. We don't see race, we don't see poverty, we don't see gender.
Very interesting.
And so it's kind of unusual for certain people to look at these things. These are some of the minor factors. Less promising targets for change, although you may want to target them, but you're going to get less bang for your buck if you go after them. Personal emotional distress. Many people talk about mental health as a risk factor. It's usually not. If you listen to Judge Leifman and talk about mental health, sometimes even in certain situations it can be a protective factor, and it's not necessarily a risk factor. If you find somebody with a mental health issue involved in the criminal justice system, there are probably other criminogenic factors that are also involved. Now, just a quick word, and I'm gonna conclude here, just to tell you about something we're doing. Secretary Jones mentioned it. John Dow mentioned it yesterday. We're calling it, and this is very much a working title, the Miami-Dade County Collaborative. It involves 5 different agencies. We've decided to embark on a course to try to get a risk needs assessment that we can use across the entire criminal justice system in Miami-Dade County. Thankfully, Department of Corrections is at the table. We just did a training where we trained 63 people in the Ohio risk assessment system. And at the end of the training, you submit your score sheet on a video you've seen. And thankfully, 59 out of 63 of the people who got trained have been certified. The other 4 will have a chance to redo another test and see where we're at. So we're trying to see if we can share these assessments across the system. Can we build a database across the system? Assessments.com is involved, and they've offered to come in and create the online version of this for us for free for 90 days, and then they want to get paid, which we may or may not go in that direction.
Great.
But we understand the marketing idea. So this is the Ohio Risk Assessment System. We have a couple of states have used this. Indiana uses it statewide, and it's called the IRAS. Texas uses it statewide, and in fact, it's mandated by statute at every level of the criminal justice system, and they call it the TRAS. We're thinking about calling it the FLORAS. And the one thing we're happy about is that we don't live in a state that starts with a P.
Yes, good, good. Okay, so John, do you think that you might be able to take us through some of your experience with the Ohio Risk Assessment?
Well, in a word, no.
No.
And you'll understand why I respond that way. David asked me to share a little bit of our experience with the proxy. And as I go through my presentation, it'll be obvious. But, and he asked me to share a little bit about what the proxy is and how we're using it and what we're going to do with the results. And the proxy, as David said, it's a second generation, just deals with risk, all static factors. It was developed by Brad Bogue and the Justice System Assessment Training Group.
We're still on the PowerPoint if they'll bring it back up for us.
Give a little background about why you're just using the proxy singularly. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
correct.
Okay, so can you share a little bit about why that is the case, and then I guess develop that, because I know there's obviously a clear reason why you've chosen that.
And one of David's comments here on the proxy, it works for jurisdictions who lack the resources to do a full assessment in the 3rd and 4th generation assessments. In misdemeanor county probation, as you know, we got counties from Miami-Dade to Hillsborough, Broward, huge counties. We do a lot of probation in very small counties and don't have a lot of resources staff-wise, training staff time, as well as training resources to use that assessment, as well as the fee of the assessment. So let me go back and finish a few more thoughts on what the proxy is. The proxy basically is traditionally used as a triage to separate the high risk from the low risk, and then to do the full-blown assessments, to the 3rd and 4th generation assessments with your high-risk people. So what we did with the resources we have, we thought the proxy would be able to meet our need. And we would be able to find out who our high-risk people, who our low-risk people are, and then establish programs and protocols to deal with those. also there's some other information before I get on to how we use it there. But the Orange County Jail is using it, Manatee County Probation is using it, and they use it strictly to find out who they feel would be appropriate for field visits. So with their high-risk people, they go out into the community and check up on them. Typically, it predicts the success of what we wanted to do is see if we could predict successful termination of probation. As David said earlier, typically it's used to see about percentage of people that reoffend or don't. And we don't have the resources to track people to see what they do once they're done on their term of probation. And probation is usually 6 or 12 months in misdemeanor probation. And once they're gone with us, it's as you know, it takes a lot of resources to track those people and find out if they've been rearrested again. But what we can track is to see if they completed probation successfully. So that's how we're using it. And once we do that, we can establish levels of supervision based on the high, medium, and low results or scores they could get from the proxy. So as I said, we want to reduce the resources that we use for our low-risk people and put those resources in to dealing with the high-risk clients.
May I ask you a question on that? As far as once you've actually done the proxy, I know we talked about with David's presentation that in some of the earlier generations there was more subjectivity, that there was more of that of the professional making a case. Are you finding that is the case with your using the proxy, or are you strictly adhering to those results from the test?
For now, we're just going with the results of the
Okay.
test. As I'll get in later in my presentation, there's some overrides we're going to put in, and then we'll deal with some staff judgment on how to proceed with those cases. Here is the proxy. I don't know if you can see it up on the screen, but the next slide, it shows a little bit clearer on the scoring. It might be a little easier to read. But it basically looks at the current age of first arrest, and the number of prior arrests. That's all that is asked in the proxy. And what we've done, we put those questions in our database. We have a case management database system where the probation officer asks these questions, and they're all self-reporting. A lot of times we don't have, being in the private sector, we don't have a lot of background information on our cases that public agencies have. So this is all based on self-reporting of the
Okay,
client.
so you're not able to verify
No.
that, okay. Has that been any problem, or you feel it's pretty good, the self-reporting?
No,
keep
as you'll see,
consistent?
the results have shown that the information that we're getting is pretty accurate and shows
Good.
pretty good scores. And basically, here's our distribution of scores by clients. 0 is obviously your low risk people that, based on those factors you just saw. And you can see that we don't have too many high-risk clients. The people who score 5 and 6 are a very small percentage of who we deal with. There's just a visual graph depicting that. Now here's the stuff that David gets all excited about. This is the here's our results from our scores. There's 24,000 clients that we scored on the proxy. As you can see by the success rates here, it follows a pretty straight pattern. Each score higher gets a higher failure or a lower success rate, and to the point of going from 83% down to 49% for those who score in the highest score is 6. And I just provided a graph to illustrate that. So what we're going to plan on doing with these results is, I say, we can establish levels of supervision, low, medium, and high risk. And what we're working on currently, this is kind of a plan that we're unfolding as we go. We wanted to get these results first, and then now that we see that we have some reliable stuff, we can move forward. So the next step we're doing is we're creating an online supervision for low-risk clients. So those people that we don't need spend a lot of time with, we have, using Google Reports actually, we've created a probation monthly report that asks the client all the information we need to get from them from on a monthly basis as they would when they come in to see us in person. And we also are establishing an online payment process. In a lot of counties, we collect monies for the clerk as well as our own administrative fees and restitution, and we disperse that restitution to the victims.
Well, it's great that you were able to use an off-the-shelf product. You didn't have to go out and reinvent the wheel.
Right. And it kind of neat thing, we're using it not as it was intended to be used.
Right,
So it's
right.
kind of a little bit out of the box and trying to do a little experiment, but it turned out to have some pretty good results. So we're pretty happy with that. And so the idea is to spend more time with those high-risk people. Is one of the principles of evidence-based practices. And so we're going to use thinking for a change. Eventually, that's be another phase. Once we get the minimum or low-risk people on the online reporting, free up some staff time, we'll establish thinking for a change classes that address some of those criminogenic needs that David talked to us about. And now, for your question about the staff input on judgment, we are going to have some overrides in addition to that. Domestic violence and battery cases that typically take a lot more staff time. There's a lot more issues in those cases that need to be addressed. And a lot of our clients have financial issues, trying to pay all their financial obligations as well as the other conditions. So people with employment issues or financial issues, even though they score low, we'll still keep them coming to see us and working with them with financial planning and employment assistance, that kind of thing.
I have a question, and this might not be the right time to interject, but maybe at some point you could address it for me, because I know one of the big concerns at the legislature this year, and as well as back home for me in Fort Myers, is the labor trafficking and human sex trafficking. And are you doing any types of assessments of them if they come in a criminal setting? Are they assessed in this way, or are they assessed in a different way?
No, we don't have, that wouldn't cover any kind of that issue. This is strictly those three static things. Now, if somebody comes in and like in any scenario, unrelated to the assessment, if you see they got black eye or they're being abused in some way, we would address that. But as far as being sex trafficking and human trafficking, no, we don't really have anything to address that specifically.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to speak to you for just a few minutes on what we're doing at Orange County in our Community Corrections Division. David spoke to you about the ORAS, and in January of 2013, our probation unit began using the Community Supervision Tool, which is a part of the ORAS assessment. And then in August of 2015, we switched over and started using the tool that was more conducive for our offender population, which is the misdemeanor assessment tool. We found that the CST, or the Community Supervision Tool, was created for long-term supervision, such as felony probation, and that the MAT was created for misdemeanor offenders. Our officers, when they were using the CST tool, that was taking about 45 minutes to an hour to conduct the interview. When we switched over to using the MAT, it was taking, or it takes them about 5 to 15 minutes versus the 45 minutes. And one of the things that became obvious to me in working with county probation is that time is not on our side. The average length of supervision for a misdemeanor offender is about 10 months, whereas with felony supervision, you can have anywhere from a year or a lifetime. So switching over to the MAT instrument was more conducive for our population. We found that the MAT evaluated 5 criminogenic needs versus the 7 that David explained on the CST, and it was more efficient for us to administer 12 questions in the MAT as opposed to the 35 questions in the CST tool. The 2 areas, when we switched over, we had some concern, were we going to miss anything in the interview that we would need to do a good assessment? And we found that the 2 areas that was not included in the MAT was the family and social support, as well as the neighborhood and peer problems. But those were areas that we found could be addressed in the initial interview with the offender as needed, depending on which individual or who the officer was speaking with. The ORAS process, we found, was enhanced during the interview due to our officers being trained in the techniques of motivational interviewing. We recently started training them in motivational interviewing. Before, they were using on their own interpersonal skills to conduct the interview. We found that the interview process is better enhanced by them using the techniques in motivational interviewing. So our plan, we're training our entire division, including our front desk receptionists, all the way up to our supervisors in motivational interviewing. We also found that the data collection confirmed that the MAT scores were more closely correlated with our proxy results. So that helped us to know that although we had switched over, we still were using and had a good sense of validation in getting the information that we needed. This next slide, John showed you the proxy that they use. This is the proxy that we use in Orange County. It's very similar, but we made some changes to it to match the demographics in our area. So what you see, and hopefully, I know you probably cannot read that, but it also have the offender provide their current age, the age at the time of arrest, and then the number of prior convictions. So if you can see the scoring, and I believe Barney mentioned earlier about the cell phone that was lost, so I was going to ask everybody if you just take these 3 questions, they're real easy to do. Your current age at this time, just write down your current age, and your age.
Do we have to tell the truth?
Yeah, they got to tell the truth. Just to make a point here, we're going to find out who took the cell phone. And then the age of first arrest. And then the last one is number of prior arrests. So let's just say 0. And so if you're over the age of 35, and I'm assuming that most people in the room may be over the age of 35, your score is going to be 0. The age of first arrest.
They haven't been arrested.
Excuse me?
You're assuming they haven't been arrested.
Right, right. Well, their current age is, if they're over 35, their age of their first arrest, and we're going to assume that the first arrest may be today. So your score, if your age of your first arrest, if you were 0 to 17, you're going to get a 3. If you were 18 to 21, your score will be 2. And so I'm assuming everybody's going to be over 22 at the age of first arrest if it's today. And so your score would be 1. And then the last question would be the number of prior arrests. And so if you had no priors, your score would be 1. 0 to 1 0 to 1 priors, your score is 1. 2 to 4, you get a 2. And if you have 6 priors or over, your score would be 3. So the average score in this room should be about 2. Is that right? Anybody want to admit? Okay. So if the score is 2, then that score is going to come out to be an offender that would be at a low risk to reoffend. So the proxy score it gives us, those 3 questions give us the risk to reoffend for each person that comes into our intake division. So if a person goes to court in Orlando or in Orange County, anywhere in Orange County, they will report to our intake. They get asked those 3 questions, and depending on their score, if they score anywhere from 7 to 8, then they're going to be considered to be a high-risk offender, and they'll be diverted to our high-risk team. If their scores are 5 to 6, then it's going to be moderate risk, and they'll be diverted to our moderate risk probation team, and a score from 2, 3, or 4 would be a low-risk offender, and it just means that their risk to reoffend would be low. So the next slide here just gives some information that validates the results that we're looking to see. On the first table, it illustrates that the proxy scores distributed throughout our Community Corrections Department. This data was taken from October 2013 to March of this year, and you can see that the scores ranging from a 2 to 4 correspond with the low-risk offenders. Scores of 5 to 6 correspond with the moderate risk, and from 7 to 8 they represent our high-risk offenders. The majority of the offenders, about 50% were considered to be low risk, about 40% were in our moderate risk category, and about 10% were classified as high risk. The second table just gives a snapshot of our division's proxy scores distributed throughout on March the 20th of this year. And similar to the proxy scores for the entire sample, the majority of our offenders, 51, almost 52%, are considered to be low risk. About 38% or 39% of our offenders are moderate risk, and the very low percentage, under 10%, are considered to be high risk.
Is there anything that surprised any of you on the panel about using these tools, these assessment tools, that you weren't expecting, or was it everything that you thought it would be, and you're pleased with the ones that you're working with?
Well, we didn't have really any specific expectation.
Okay.
But I was real pleased with how it turned out, how the results did show that the people that scored low did have a high success rate, and something we could depend on and build some programming around.
And I think if you look at this next slide, if they can put this next slide up, the proxy, this will answer that question. This proxy study that we did, the table shows, it represents our division's successful rate by proxy score. And as you can see, 88% of the offenders with a proxy score of 2 were successful under supervision. As the proxy score increases, the success rate decreases. So with a proxy score of 3, there's 82% of the offenders were successful. A proxy score of 4, 77% were successful under supervision. 5, 73%. And a proxy score of 6, 57% were successful. A proxy score of 7, because we're getting higher to the higher risk, 52% were successful. And finally, the highest score of 8, only 41% of the offenders were successful under supervision.
Let me go back to Linda and talk about the fact that please understand that these guys have really thought out of the box, because the proxy was never supposed to be used to predict probation success. It was strictly developed for Project Hope to see who would get a full-blown assessment and who wouldn't. What we found out, and the reason John talks about the override, and Linda hasn't mentioned it yet, about the override, is people, I'll give you a particular case. I had a gentleman whose age at first arrest was 45, low risk. Number of prior arrests were 3, and current age was 45. He came out as a 2. Mm-hmm. The problem was, this was a domestic violence case, and although his first arrest was this year, it had escalated and escalated and escalated. So you need to be in a position to say, this is not a low-risk guy. We're going to have to do something different with him. And I don't know if, Linda, if you have anything.
Right, you're correct. We do overrides. We do not override the risk to reoffend. Using the example that you just gave, if the offender scored out as a 2, which is saying that he has a low risk to reoffend, what we would do, because of the type of charge, if it's anything DUI, domestic violence, prostitution, then we override the type of supervision, the unit that would handle that case. So whereas a 2 would normally go to our low-risk team, we would override and assign it to our high-risk team, but their proxy score remains the same.
Interesting.
Just how we handle them would be differently. So conducting the ORAS, after we get the proxy score and we know which team the offender would be assigned to, anyone with a proxy score of 6, 7, or 8, we're going to do the ORAS that I explained to you earlier. And we're going to do the misdemeanor assessment tool. The higher the assessment score, which again, I want to keep reiterating, is just indicating that that person has a greater risk to reoffend. So the scores of a 6, 7, and 8 is going to get an ORAS completed. And the officers will do that by using an interview guide that comes with the ORAS instrument. They'll use self-reporting information that the offender provides. They'll do a file review, and then as well as gather collateral information. And I mentioned that the motivational interviewing training has shown to be very helpful for us in getting the information that we need, doing it in a relaxed environment, getting the individual comfortable to provide honest information that we can provide adequate case planning for. The case plan and interventions are linked to the assessment results. And the areas where problems are identified, they are addressed with intervention and program referrals. If there is no problem, then there is no action required other than ensuring that the compliance of the court order is fulfilled. And some of the programming that we're doing in our division is we are implementing Thinking for Change in our probation department. We're using Thinking for Change already with our inmate side of the house and our inmate programs. Our staff that works with the inmate programs use Thinking for Change. So we have started to address with our administrative judge using Thinking for Change as an alternative sanction for technical violations or as a graduated sanction versus just going to the court asking for a warrant on some technical violations. Our officers are also building a case plan that would match each offender's needs based on their own unique pattern of showing their risk and what the appropriate programs or needs that they have based on the misdemeanor assessment tool that we use. This slide just shows that our case plan development is devised by the needs and problems, which is based on the validated assessment tool. Goals, we're looking for long-term outcomes where the offender, we're looking at the end results. Where do we want this offender to be after our intervention? So it's sort of like beginning with the end in mind. Where do you want to see the offender to be? Our objectives is we try to give the offender some short-term, measurable, and goals that they can accomplish immediately to show some success as well as encouragement. And then the techniques that we're using is actions that would help the offender to reach their long-term goals, such as the Thinking for Change that we mentioned, other program tools, life skills, anger management, whatever type of referral they may need in addition to what the court has ordered. And lastly, the techniques that our officers are using is addressed in the supervision techniques, referrals that they have, as well as the face-to-face contacts or the contact requirements based on each team. Our low-risk supervision team, we use telephone reporting as one of the methods for our low risk. So if they score is up to in our intake, they'll see where they score out from 2 to 4, 2, 3, or 4, and make the referral to our low risk team. And if appropriate, they'll put them on telephone reporting, which means that they'll just phone in weekly and give any updates to the officer that they may need. And what we're doing also is we're making some realignment changes within the division so that right now we have some officers, our probation officers, that are monitoring our telephone reporting, and we're looking at utilizing that resource by, we have paraprofessional positions and assigning them to monitor the telephone reporting. Whatever the needs are, most of the time it's just questions that the offenders need asked, and use those officers and assign them to our moderate team and our high-risk team, which those offenders have a higher need for intervention. So we're making some realignments there with our contacts. And that's pretty much it. We're open for any questions.
Well, clearly, as we stated at the beginning, what David walked us through, there have been a lot of innovations in how you assess and how you respond and meet the different needs for moderate offenders versus, offenders that are at greater risk of reoffending. We're at the fourth generation. Are there things that you see on the horizon or would like to see that, or other states might be doing that are out there that you would want to share with the group?
I think where Linda is at this point is where we'd like to encourage other agencies to head towards. We haven't gotten there yet. We wanted to get the ORS training in. But one of the things we're tasked with in Miami-Dade is we have the 11th Judicial Circuit is depending on us. We've taken over from DCF to do assessment and evaluation of batterers. ORAS is going to be a central part of that, and we're going to add to that the ODARA, which is a risk assessment tool coming out of Canada that deals with batterers. And to put the two together, we're then going to use that as our evaluation tool.
So that tool deals strictly with batterers?
Strictly with batterers.
Okay.
And sometimes you have to, those of us who work in probation know if I do a risk assessment and I find a guy is high risk on a misdemeanor case, it's going to be frowned upon if I take that case back to court and tell the judge, no, you have to impose these conditions. So what we do is we do the best we can, and I always tell people, have a conversation. If your guy comes out at high risk on the proxy, for instance, let's tell him this. Statistics we show that somebody in your situation is going to have a tough time completing probation. My job is to make sure that doesn't happen. Let's sit down and figure out what we can do to make sure you get through this probation period successfully. So not everything has to be court mandated. I think it can start a conversation that I think is important with our offenders. And Linda mentioned it a little bit, and we talked about it before. Sometimes we're dealing with people who have never had any victories and have only seen bad news things happen to them. And when you can get a little bit of a victory with people, it's a big deal.
Right. Any questions for this great panel?
I wanted to mention one other thing. I talked a lot about probation, but I also wanted to mention that we used the proxy. I think it was on David's slide. We used the proxy in our booking to determine which inmates, the higher their risk, where they score out on the proxy, the higher the risk they show. We provide targeted programs in the jail for them depending on their risk status. So not only are we using it in probation, but we also use it in our inmate programming side of the house.
Great. There's a couple of questions. Barney, do you still have your microphone or you're, all right. Step lively there. All right, who's
Take
first?
questions. Gail?
Thank you, Barney. Hi, thank you all for sharing with us today. I'm curious, are you using this with all offenders, regardless of what the offense is, when they come in to assess them?
Yes, we are. Everyone
we are
that
as
comes
well.
in from court and they report to our intake unit, that's one of the first things they do is the proxy. And based on the scores that they get indicating their risk to reoffend is where they divert them to the probation unit that will actually either do an ORAS or do whatever other type of intervention they feel is needed based on that risk score.
That's in Orange County.
That's in Orange County.
In Miami, when you're doing the R&Rs, are you using that on all classifications of offenders?
Now, the plan is going to be, we have not implemented this yet. We're capturing the proxy data within our system. But when we get a high-risk proxy case, then we're going to go ahead and use the ORAS. But for right now, it won't be relevant to the charge, but it'll be relevant to the legal supervision. So because we get a number of pretrial diversion cases as well as probation cases.
So these are only for pretrial diversion? You're going to be doing this, not for anybody just in general arrest?
Right, I get people sent to us just for community service. We're not going to spend the time on doing that, but if we're under supervision to us for DUI diversion, regular misdemeanor diversion, or for probation, we'll be doing it and implementing it.
Other questions?
There's one right behind you.
Yes, we'll have, these slides will be on our website starting tomorrow. Is there a question over here? Let me ask you, how do you know that the folks are answering all the questions, honestly? I mean, you can look at their antisocial history, but how do you look at some of the other things and know that they're telling you the truth?
Well, I guess we don't for sure, but as I said earlier, the results seem, the answers they are giving us are showing an accurate correlation between high scores and low success rates. So you can assume based on that they're giving us accurate information. And they don't know that we don't know what we don't know.
Good point.
And you have other tools. You can run a criminal history. You have collateral information that you can talk to their family members. If they are repeat offenders, then you have, previous information that you can validate what you're getting.
We did the proxy on about 1,000 offenders, and we took a randomized, we ran about 10% of them through criminal histories, and we found a cheating rate of about 1%. I think John said it right.
better than
They
most
have no
high
idea
schools.
that we don't necessarily know.
Yeah, so now, what is the optimum ratio between a probation officer and the clients that they see, and then what is it with your different programs?
Our typical caseload across the board is about 200 to 1. But with this new information, will be the high-risk cases will be obviously a lot lower than that, be able to spend a lot more time with them.
What's the optimum, though? What would be your goal in a perfect world?
I don't know. I mean, we are based on what we can afford to staff we can afford to hire, and I think we're in the same boat. Salvation Army is no different than Advocate or other places. Now, some of the public programs do have a little more resources, but I think if we get caseloads of around 100 to 1 for high risk and can put them through some programming, we also utilize a lot of community resources. Don't do it all ourselves. So I think a reasonable caseload would be 100 to 1. If you need a number, that would be what I'd say.
Linda, how about your programs?
And our low-risk caseloads are running a little over 200, maybe about 230. Most of them are on telephone reporting. Our high-risk offenders are between our ideal caseload is about 80 to 85, and then the moderate team would have anywhere from 100 to 160, 70.
Perhaps
David,
since you utilize Google, maybe we could use FaceTime for the phone reporting.
Yeah, well, they have a lot of different supervision tools for the low-risk offenders. Kiosks, they're using kiosks in some locations for them to report in. So.
I'm sorry,
David, how about
Go ahead. You were
David,
gonna
how
s-
about your program down in Miami-Dade?
Ours is really tough because we have as many pretrial diversion cases as we have probation cases, and our pretrial diversion cases are all first offenders. So I would guess any particular caseload would be around 250 to 300, but I have a number of those who are first offenders, so that takes proportionately less work than you do with probation people.
And then you obviously have the problem of language barriers, understanding. Is that an issue for y'all down there in Miami-Dade?
We're not allowed to have the problem of language barriers in Miami, so we're able to accommodate that pretty well.
Okay.
Okay.
Well,
Thank-
thank y'all very much for this. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Representative Fitzenhagen.